One very important HTML element that is used in creating a template are tables. Tables come in two different flavors: the static table, which are mostly used for designing and placement and navigation, whereas dynamic tables are used to add detail lines and transactional data to a template. So let's start by adding a static table. In this template, what we want to do is to add a table at the top with an address block on the left and some customer information on the right. So the first thing we want to do is to click on Insert Table in the toolbar. The static table insert wizard has just a couple of information you want to put in here. As far as the ID and class is concerned, take a look at the animation on selectors, IDs, and classes later down in the course in order to be able to use them. For the columns and rows, this basically determines how your table is going to start with in terms of how many columns, header and body rows, and footer rows you're going to have. So the columns is the number of vertical separations, whereas the rows is the number of horizontal separations. So here what we would have is a table of 3 columns by 2 rows, where the first row is a header and the second one is a body. I actually do not want a header row. I just want a single body row because I'm going to split it in 2. And I'm going to have some information on the left and some information on the right. In the second window, you have to choose what kind of style you want to apply onto the table. Now, we already have a couple of predefined styles, mostly a couple of different colors and a few of them that have shading. Shading means that every odd or even row will have a background color that is shaded with the color from the style. But we actually want to have no style at all because this is just navigation. We don't want any borders or any colors inside of this. When you first add a table, especially with no styling, you won't see the little green border that I see here. This is because I'd already activated the Show Edges button. And this is basically a way to show anything that you have on the page. So tables, divs, or boxes, anything that is an element, except for paragraphs and headers, will appear with a border. Now that makes it a bit easier to create navigations when you don't have a border on the table. That way you can actually resize and see everything directly without having to add a border. Now, I already have my scripts prepared on the left, so what I'm going to do is simply add the placeholder, and that will automatically add the text into the left part of the table. So when I go into preview mode, I have the full address block. Now this was done just with the script with multiple lines of text, prefixes, and suffixes. That looks kind of like this. Now on the right part, I actually want to add another table inside of this one because tables within tables is something that's fairly straightforward in HTML. I just click inside the table and run my wizard again. This time I only want 2 columns, but we want to have 5 body rows. And again, no style because we don't want any borders. And all I need to do is to enter the information, so the titles on the left and the placeholders on the right. So now that I have all the information inside of my table, we can actually take just a little bit of time to style it so it looks a bit nicer. If you select multiple rows and you apply a style to it, it'll apply the style to everything inside those rows, even text you add later. So clicking on bold will actually bold all the contents of these table cells. And if I align those to the right, any text that I add to it afterwards is always aligned to the right. Now, if I remove these show edges, you can see how it will actually look on the page. Now let's add the dynamic table, so basically all the line items from the detail table. It's almost just as easy. You click on the Insert Detail Table icon inside the toolbar, but here you don't select the number of header, footer, and body rows because that's determined by the actual detail table. But you do have to select which table you're going to use if there is more than one inside of your record. Then you need to decide which rows you want to show inside of the table. You don't necessarily need to show all of them. For example, I never have any item back-ordered inside of my invoices, so I'm simply going to ignore that specific line. Then you can decide whether or not you want to automatically calculate the subtotals. This is useful especially if you have a very high number of line items overflowing on multiple pages. What this is going to do is to add a subtotal at the bottom of each of the pages and the same subtotal at the top of the next page, which is called the transport line. So when you check the calculate subtotals, you need to select which column has all of the actual subtotal or the total for each line. This only works if the total line was actually set as a currency. If it's a string or anything else, this is not going to work. And this is why it's important to set the appropriate data types inside of your data mapping configuration. And again, we have the ability to select a style. This time, we will select something that already has a pre-existing alternate background because it looks nicer when you have an invoice like that. So now we have a nice little dynamic table that was added. Here's a couple of things that you can do to manipulate the table and add a couple of interesting things. Now, first of all, what we have appearing at the complete bottom of the table is a subtotal. There's no total or taxes for the end of the document. So let's add that right now. For that, we need to go into the design mode. What we also want is for the taxes and total only to appear on the last page. In order to set this up, we need to select the row itself. Now, one way you can select a row is inside of the toolbars, where you can select row. And then in the attributes pane, you say when you want that row to be shown. What we want here is only at the end of the table, which is basically on the very last page, whatever number of pages you have. The other thing you can do to select the row is to use the breadcrumbs at the top of the workspace, and that gives you exactly the same options. Let me just add the labels. And align them to the right. And because the color scheme is already set up, let's change the header so that it has the appropriate colors. So now when we go in the preview mode, now you can tweak this as much as you want just to make it look exactly how you want. For example, if I want to reduce the size of the product number column, I can do that simply by using the handle to resize it and do things like align numbers to the right, etc. Now, basically, working with tables here is like working with tables anywhere else. The only difference is that we automatically create the number of rows in the dynamic tables that we want to have. Now, here's the thing. If we change the record for someone that has more detailed lines, then you can see how the overflow works. So we know it works beautifully. It just creates a new table, re-adds the header on the top, and the reason it adds the subtotal just below the header is because we checked the transport line, and then you have the subtotal and you have everything else. And there you have all the basics to create your own tables, style them, and make them work your own way.